Hello friends, after a long wait and no small amount of secrecy and anticipation, Joola is releasing their new Gen 3 paddle line today. We've all seen the Joola pros playing with the alpha prototypes of these paddles for months now, and there's been a lot of speculation about what's going on under the hood for these new paddles. So, do the Gen 3 Joolas live up to the hype? Let's find out. The first thing to note here is that the new Gen 3 paddles are upgrades to the existing line of Joola paddles. So besides the new Tyson McGuffin Magnum paddle, all others use the same shape and dimensions as their previous versions. So if you're currently playing with a Perseus or Scorpeus or Hyperion, these new paddles will be the exact same shape but with new technology, namely in the core. And of course there are new graphics and colors. Also new for the Joola Gen-3 paddles is an NFC chip embedded in the handle that you can scan with the new Joola Connect app to register your paddle for a 12-month warranty. As of the making of this video, the Connect app is not up yet, so I have no idea what that will be like. But I imagine they'll also put paid content on there, so lesson plans and the like. All right, moving on to the specs. The Perseus and Hyperion are elongated paddles measuring 16.5 inches long by 7.5 inches wide with a 5.5-inch handle. The Scorpeus is a standard shape paddle measuring 16 by 8 inches with a 5.25-inch handle. And the Magnus is a new shape for Joola measuring 16.5 by 7.5 inches with a shorter 5-inch handle. All of these shapes come in two thicknesses, 16 millimeters and 14 millimeters. Otherwise, all of these models have been given a facelift. Joola went from a subdued gray to bright gradient colors for the edge guards. There's a turquoise blue for Ben John's Perseus, green for Ben's Hyperion, blue for Simone's Hyperion, orange for Collin's Scorpeus, yellow for Anna's Scorpeus, and pink for Tyson's Magnus. Now, as of today, I have all of the Joola Gen 3 models except for the Hyperions. So this review will cover most, but not all of the new releases. They are sending me the Hyperions, so I'll review those later. All of my paddles come in right at 8.0 ounces except for the Anna Bright Scorpeus, which is 7.8 ounces. And the swing weights range from a high of 119 for the Perseus 16mm to a low of 109 for the Anna Bright Scorpeus. Twist weight ranges from a high of 6.94 for the Collin John's Scorpeus to a low of 5.83 for the 14mm Perseus. So I'm going to skip through things like raw carbon fiber surface and other tech because they're the same as previous Gen 2 Joola models. I want to focus here on the main new tech of these paddles, which is what they're calling the propulsion core. And they're making three broad claims about it. Number one, more dwell time of the ball on the face, which is supposed to help with spin. Number two, more power. They're claiming a 10% acceleration increase. And number three, more consistent control. So what exactly is the propulsion core? Are the rumors true that Joola now has what's become known as the floating core, like the Gearbox Pro series? Well, sort of. Here's a graphic from Joola showing the layup of the core. Unlike the Gearbox, which uses foam and carbon fiber ribs, Joola uses the more traditional polypropylene honeycomb for most of the core, but they've cut it back along the sides and the top of the paddle and replaced it with foam. So it's not entirely a floating core like the Gearbox, but it's a similar idea. A better term for this would be a framed core. The theory behind it is that by suspending the core in foam, it can bend and flex in ways that a normal core can't. This is what Joola is calling dwell time. Another appropriate term would be the trampoline effect, where the foam acts like the springs on a trampoline. Or maybe a more appropriate analogy for the Gen 3s would be a diving board effect. Since the core is not entirely suspended, it presumably moves and springs more like a diving board. So if the theory holds true, then yes, there is more dwell time, but the diving board effect should also produce more power. I dissected the Perseus 3 by sectioning it down the middle so you can open it like a sandwich. And here's what that cut looks like. You can see all of the same parts that were shown in the Joola graphic, so the polypropylene core and the foam around the edges. Let me make a quick point of clarification. The yellow foam you see going around the entire perimeter is what Joola calls the hyper foam edge wall, or what's commonly known as edge foam. And this is nothing new. It was first introduced in the Hyperion 2 years ago and has become widespread in thermoformed paddles for more than a year now. Here's a sectioned thermoformed paddle, the bread and butter filth, showing the same edge foam. But the white foam that extends beyond the edge foam into the interior of the core is the new part. It's a much softer foam than the yellow stuff, and it appears to be fixed to the honeycomb core with epoxy. If I had to guess, I'd say maybe it's some sort of polyethylene, which is the same class of foams that EVA falls into. But it's softer than the EVA that's typically used in paddle cores and for shoes. But yeah, that's it. It really doesn't look like a ton of new tech. Basically, they're just replacing about half an inch of the polymer core with foam around the sides and the top. If I were to just look at this without playing with the paddles, I wouldn't expect this to make much of a difference. Compare this to the Gearbox Pro Series. This is the control model. There's just so much more going on inside the gearbox. Carbon fiber ribs are filled with foam and surrounded by several layers of different kinds of foam that extend way further into the core. So yeah, by looking at the insides, I'd expect the gearbox to play a lot different than traditional honeycomb paddles, but maybe not so much the Joola. Not to spoil the end of the video, but let's just say that I am surprised what a difference it does make. One thing I noticed when unwrapping these paddles is that the carbon fiber roughness varied quite a bit. The Magnus felt ridiculously gritty, and the Collin Johns felt much smoother. And on the Perseus 14mm, one side felt grittier than the other. And this is reflected in the spin rates I got on these paddles. The Perseus 16mm and Magnus 14mm both got higher spin numbers than any other paddle I've ever tested. They both averaged over 2,400 RPM. Now, I don't have a stare-at machine, but judging just from touching it and from these spin numbers, I have a hunch these units are out of spec. This was something we all noticed also at the Joola pre-launch event in New Orleans. The alpha pre-production models felt insanely gritty, and they generated crazy amounts of spin.
I found that gets the best reading. It picks up the ball the best.
All right, let me try.
You've gotten that high before, though, haven't you?
Yeah, but that was a power serve.
That was just a normal serve?
Yeah. Let's try this serve.
26, dude. Like, that's legit.
That's crazy.
I mean, let's do a few more, see if you get that.
Yeah.
And when I received the production models, some of them felt like sandpaper and others not so much. Given the variability in roughness in the paddles I was sent, I'm wondering if the earliest batch that I received is not quite what the true first production run will be like. At least for the texture on these paddles, it seems like they were still ironing out some wrinkles in the production chain. The other paddles ranged from 2,100 to 2,300 RPM, placing them all in the top tier category. But remember how I said that the 14mm Perseus had different levels of roughness on each face? Although it averaged 2193 RPM across both faces, the rougher face actually averaged 2416 RPM, and the smoother face averaged only 1860 RPM. That's over 500 RPM, a pretty massive difference. Again, there does seem to be some hiccups in the early run production. All right, so let's move on to what everyone wants to know about these paddles: power and pop. Does the propulsion core live up to its name? Let's start with power. I define power as the velocity imparted on a ball with full swings like serves, drives from the baseline, and overhead putaways. The power of these paddles is right up there in line with the Gearbox Pro Series, which up to now is the most powerful USAP-approved paddle on the market. The only paddles that get more power are EVA foam paddles, which aren't legal for tournament play. Plus, this is getting within the lower range of EVA foam paddles. So the Hyperion 16mm has the highest power rating for the Gen 3 paddles I tested, falling at the 95th percentile. And the lowest of the bunch wasn't that far behind. Both the Hyperion 14mm and the Scorpeus 14mm fall at the 91st percentile for power. When I did my review of the Gearbox Pro Series, I mentioned that it's rare for a paddle to have high power and pop. Usually it's one or the other or neither. But one of the things that made the Gearbox special was that it ranked high for power and pop. Again, I'm defining pop as the velocity put on a ball with shorter strokes such as punch volleys, counters, and flicks at the kitchen. And the Gearbox paddles fell within the 96th and 97th percentiles for pop, just under the long-reigning champion, the Pro Kinetics Black Ace. Well, there's a new top dog for pop. Actually, 3 of the Joola Gen-3 paddles scored higher than the Black Ace on pop: the Anna Bright Scorpeus, Collin John Scorpeus, and Perseus 14mm. And the Perseus 16mm and Magnus 14mm aren't far behind, falling in the same range as the Gearbox Pro Series paddles. Okay, something important to note here is that there does seem to be a break-in period for the Gen 3 paddles, similar to the Gearbox. I've been playing with the alpha versions now for 3 weeks, and they did seem to loosen up and become more powerful and poppy. I noticed that the new production models felt slightly more muted when I hit with them after playing with ones that were broken in. By the way, all of the power and pop measurements that I'm presenting here were done on the new production models, completely stock without lead tape. For comparison, I pulled out my broken in and leaded up Gearbox and Hyperion 16mm alpha and did a quick speed test, and they both scored within EVA foam paddle range above all other tournament legal paddles. So yes, these paddles get hotter as time goes on. Over the past 3 weeks, I've been playing with the alpha paddles and recently the production models, which are the same thing. So I have a good sense of how they perform. One of the first things you'll notice is the power and pop. I remember at the New Orleans Joola event when everyone got to the courts and were given the paddles. Before I even got onto the court, I knew just from watching other people hit with them that they were going to be hot. My immediate thought on my first game was that they hit hard, but maybe not quite as hard as my Gearbox. But now I realize that that was because they were new and not broken in, and I did not have them weighted up like my Gearbox. Both my Gearbox and my broken in Perseus with lead generate the same level of power when playing side by side. The next thing I noticed was the large sweet spot. Honestly, I didn't think the Gearbox sweet spot was bad, but playing side by side with the Joola Gen 3s, the difference is noticeable. Particularly stock, there's a lot more forgiveness with the Joola paddles compared to the Gearbox. And adding lead or tungsten tape only helps. I think the 16mm Gen 3 versions can be played stock, but the 14mm versions need some weight around the neck and shoulder region to make them more stable. So far so good, but what about control? My initial impression is that they had pretty decent control. I'd say noticeably better than the Gearbox. But I did notice that as time goes on, the Gen 3s become harder to control. So there are a couple of reasons for this. First, as they break in, they become more powerful. Second, as the surface texture wears down, you do lose some spin and the ability to shape the ball as much. That being said, I do think there is some legitimacy in the claim that there is more dwell time on the Gen 3 paddles, which also helps generate spin. So the texture isn't the only thing generating spin. But yeah, as the paddle becomes hotter and the spin potential drops, it does get more difficult to control. I did run an experiment just for this to compare ball rebound for these paddles compared to some other well-known brands. So I set a ball machine to fire at 30 miles per hour at a stationary paddle and measured the distance the ball traveled before it bounced. So 30 miles per hour is a good approximation of a speed up during a kitchen exchange. So this mimics how far the ball would travel if you were just to hold your paddle still. I shot 50 balls at each paddle and marked the distance of the ball that went the furthest. As expected, the Joola Gen 3 paddles rebounded the balls further at around 12 feet from the paddle. This was the same distance as the Gearbox Pro Power Elongated. The ball rebound on a Vatic Prism Flash, which is a control-oriented paddle, was 20 inches shorter, and the new Engage Pursuit Pro 1 was right in between. As an aside, I probably won't be doing this experiment again because you need to set it up exactly the same each time in terms of the distance of the machine from the paddle, angle of the paddle. There are just too many variables that could change from session to session. But I thought this was a good way to show that yes, the ball will come off faster and travel further with these paddles, so they will take some skill to control. Still, I feel more comfortable with the control on the Joolas than I do with the gearbox. The larger sweet spot helps you trust the paddle more, particularly with the wider Scorpeus paddles. And the spin seems better on the Gen 3s even after about 3 weeks of play. I don't know how long that will last though. The texture on the gearbox starts out less gritty, but it seems to be more durable than most raw carbon fiber paddles. And so far, Joola doesn't have the best track record with the durability of their raw carbon fiber texture, which can sometimes wear down quickly. And there's no indication that they've changed anything in their formula since their previous Gen 2 paddles, other than bringing the texture right up to the legal limits, if not over. But I have to say the combination of extreme spin and great power is a lot of fun to play with. You can do things with these paddles that just don't seem right on a pickleball court. The amount of dip you get on the ball with topspin allows you to really wail on serves and drives and still get the ball in. And you can get a lot more aggressive with dinks with hard slices or topspin that kicks the ball wide. So what's my favorite of these choices? Like I said, I haven't played with the Hyperion yet, but so far my favorites are the Perseus 16mm and both of the Scorpeuses, Collins and Annas. The Perseus 16 is a cannon, and there's enough control there to feel confident at the net with some practice. The Perseus 14 felt a little unbalanced to me in terms of hand speed, which is a little slower for an elongated paddle, and pop, which is higher with a thinner paddle. I just wasn't able to dial it in as easily as the others. And I'm having a hard time deciding which is my favorite between the Collin and the Anna. I do love the maneuverability and control of the Collin, but the combination of wicked hand speed and ridiculous pop with the Anna is a ton of fun. So the Collin is a safer bet for sure if you're looking to minimize pop-ups and for control, and the Anna is a great choice for people wanting fast hands and the best pop on the market. And Tyson's Magnus is a good choice for anyone who likes an elongated paddle with a short handle. That's not me since I use a two-handed backhand, but it's good to have this as an option for people who only use one hand on the paddle. I'd put all of these paddles squarely in the power category, with Collin's Scorpeus on the control side of the power spectrum, and Ben's 16mm Hyperion on the extreme power side of the spectrum. I do think these paddles will be very popular. I mean, I've seen a ton of the original Perseus paddles out there, and in my opinion, the Gen 3 Perseus is way better. I think the original Scorpeus paddles were good, and there are certainly improvements on their Gen 3 counterparts too, if you're looking for more offensive weapons. These paddles are a ton of fun to play with, and they can be very effective weapons in the right hands. But they're not for everyone. If you struggle with pop-ups and keeping the ball in, you'd probably be better off with a more muted paddle. Or if you excel in the touch game and you're happy with your control paddle, then these are not for you either. But if you have good skill in the control game and you're looking for more put-away power and more ability to pressure your opponents, then these are some of the best on the market right now for power and pop. And I think the designs look great too. It's nice to see some unique colorways from Joola. As you can imagine, these paddles aren't cheap. They cost $280 each, and unfortunately, I'm not able to give you a discount code yet. Joola isn't allowing discounts on their Gen 3 paddles for about 3 months or so. But when they do lift that discount ban, you can take 10% off with the code JohnQ. But if you do want to purchase the paddle now, I have an affiliate link in the description that provides a small kickback, which helps me keep making content like this. As always, thank you for watching, and please do leave some comments and questions down below. And hit those like and subscribe buttons while you're at it. Also, if you want to dig into any of the data I presented here, I have a paddle database with all of these metrics and much, much more at my website, johnqpickleball.com.